Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. The final report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into COVID-19 has been released. Deciding that the first phase of the inquiry was inadequate, the coalition government expanded the terms of reference to focus on lockdowns and vaccine mandates. In particular, finding out whether the former government had considered the impact these decisions would have on society, health, education and our economy. The report makes 24 formal recommendations, including framing the elimination strategy as temporary, limiting the use of urgency in lawmaking, keeping an eye on the research around social cohesion, and creating financial assistance scheme options ahead of a next crisis. But wasn't there already an inquiry? Why did ACT and New Zealand First both insist on another? And will this government make any moves on these recommendations? Today on The Front Page, Health Minister Simeon Brown is with us to discuss the final report's findings and whether we've actually learned anything from it. So, Minister, first tell me about the importance of this report. What's the purpose of it?
Well, this report was commissioned by this government to look at some of the key decisions made during the COVID-19 pandemic by the previous government, particularly the effect of the lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and also the economic impact of the decisions that were made at the time. And it's really important that this report was done because these decisions had such an enormous impact on everyone's life in New Zealand in terms of how the economy, in terms of our health system, and also in terms of everyone's individual ability to see their friends and neighbours and family and friends. So and of course their work. So every aspect of our life was impacted by COVID, and so it's critically important that we ask the hard questions. And today this report's now been tabled in Parliament. Did
the Phase 1 report that the last government commissioned, did that not ask the tough questions?
Look, no, it didn't go far. It didn't go far enough. It asked a large number of questions in relation to pandemic preparedness, things such as the vaccine rollout, access to tests. So it asked a number of important questions, but ultimately didn't ask some of the harder and tougher questions, which were in terms of the effect of the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, the economic cost of the previous government's decisions. And effectively what this report has found is that the last government did lock New Zealanders down for longer than was necessary. It did spend more than was required to respond to the pandemic and kept on spending. And ultimately, New Zealanders are still feeling the cost of that still today with in terms of cost in the economy. So this report was critically important because we need to learn the lessons. And as the report says, the best thing that can be done in terms of preparing for future shocks, whether that's a pandemic, a natural disaster or an economic shock, is we have to have prudent fiscal management of our economy in order to be as prepared as possible in the case of any particular future shocks that we may face as a country.
Right, so this report suggests that many opportunities to improve economic decision-making were missed throughout the response. Can you give me an example of maybe one of these missed opportunities?
Well, I think what the report highlights, and this follows on from the Treasury report last year, which shows that around half of the $60 billion that was spent responding to COVID was actually spent on things which weren't necessarily related to COVID. And, an example of that was in relation to the so-called shovel-ready projects, a number of projects across the country designed to get infrastructure underway, but many of those projects weren't shovel already, but they were inflationary and they did push costs up through the economy. And that was an example where the government, once the advice came through very clearly from Treasury saying actually the amount of money that's being spent is stimulatory, it is pushing up inflation. The government had opportunity to start turning the dial down on some of that expenditure, which would have reduced inflation in the economy. And New Zealanders would be better off today if they had actually made those decisions. But unfortunately, they didn't. And as the report finds, the Commission finds, they were not aware of any decision or anything that was done where they actually tried to reduce the stimulatory impact of their fiscal policies during the response to the pandemic, despite many opportunities to do so.
Would that have kept people employed, though?
Well, many of these projects didn't start for years after the funding was actually applied. And so the report says, actually, if you're going to try and stimulate the economy, the thing you need to be doing is making sure that's going into things which actually make a real difference straight away. They need to be timely. They need to be quick to set up. It recommends actually the best thing that the last government could have done is actually invest in maintenance and repairs. And, we think of all the potholes that were developing on the roads during those times. Actually, that's where, if you think about a timely response, which actually is focused on employment, those types of initiatives would have been far more effective than big capital projects which take years to get going, and by that stage is having a real inflationary impact. And we saw the inflationary impact of that of the economic response the last government undertook.
So the inquiry also found that social spending boosts provided a safety net, but obviously cost billions and contributed to inflation. Net government debt as a share of GDP almost doubled between 2019 and 2022. Does it give any clues as to what we perhaps could have done instead? Because vision is 2020 in hindsight, right?
Well, no doubt we needed to spend money responding to the pandemic, from a health perspective, making sure that we kept people in jobs through the wage support. That was critically important to protect lives and livelihoods. But, as the Treasury report and as the Royal Commission highlights, half of the money that was spent didn't have a connection to a direct response to the actual pandemic. And money was spent on initiatives which continued for many years to come afterwards. This government has been elected to cut wasteful spending, to get government expenditure back under control, because that's critically important to reduce inflation, reduce interest rates, so that Kiwis aren't feeling the pressure left behind by the previous government. So the lesson here is twofold. Expenditure needs to be timely. It needs to be focused on the issue, but also the previous government didn't take the opportunities that they did have. It particularly highlights the period of time between around February 2021 and August 2021, where New Zealand was not facing COVID in the community, unlike many other countries. That was an opportunity for them, and they were also being advised that they were having a stimulatory impact on the economy through their expenditure. That was the time for them to actually reduce the expenditure that they were making and think differently about how they responded. They didn't take up those opportunities. But looking forward, we have to think about how do we be prepared in the face of future uncertainty, whether that's an economic shock. We're currently facing the situation with Iran, whether it's a natural disaster or whether that's a pandemic. The best thing that we can do as a country to be prepared is to make sure we have prudent fiscal economic plans. And the best way to do that is to make sure we have a growing economy. So that is very much in line with the government's approach at the moment around our economic policies. And going back to the old days of spending, borrowing, and spending on programs which don't actually have an impact is not the solution, and will not make us more prepared for future shocks, which this report highlights the need for us to be very mindful of.
The report also suggests that a former minister has actually come out and acknowledged that the public health benefits of lockdowns did not emphatically outweigh the costs by the end of 2021. Now, how could this be true, do you think, given the fact that it is a fact that fewer people died from COVID in New Zealand than in almost any other OECD country?
Well, I think what the report highlights is that, for many, and most New Zealanders would agree that the initial lockdowns were critically important to protect lives, livelihoods, and that New Zealand benefited from that. As we got into late 2021, the previous government struggled to actually form an exit strategy and to give New Zealanders their freedom back. And actually what the report highlights is they actively ignored the officials' advice from the Ministry of Health, which gave them the opportunity to lift those restrictions sooner. And they didn't. And a couple of examples of that is they left Auckland in level 4 for longer than needed in late 2021, against official advice. They also left a boundary in place around Auckland over the summer of 21-22, which officials recommended was not necessary, was not needed. Auckland had already been in lockdown for many months at that point, and there was no need for that. The vaccination rates across the country were very high, and it wasn't needed. In fact, the officials said that boundary should have been lifted on the 15th of December. Chris Hipkins went to Cabinet and said, my view is it should stay until the 9th of January. Cabinet eventually agreed to the 16th of January. It actually went for even a longer period of time. And so Aucklanders had their summer taken away from them after months of lockdown, whilst at the same time, the official advice was being ignored. And New Zealanders put a huge amount of trust and confidence in the ministers of the day, and in Chris Hipkins. He stood up every single day and he said, I am doing this on the basis of official health advice. The Royal Commission highlights in a number of instances, no, he wasn't. And New Zealanders deserve transparency, so they could have trust and confidence in terms of these major decisions that really impacted them and are still impacting them today.
Is it sometimes, though, better to be safe than sorry?
Well, I think in this regard, you need to make sure you're getting the balance right. And many Aucklanders had done the right thing, had got vaccinated, had some of the highest rates in the country, and the government chose to ignore the official health advice. This was health advice saying it's safe to remove these restrictions. We were being told by Chris Hipkins that he was following health advice, and really it's up to him to explain why he made that decision. It's up to him. He owes an explanation to New Zealanders and to Aucklanders as to why he ignored that advice, why he left those restrictions in place longer, and ultimately why we're facing the economic and social costs which followed from that. The lockdowns were not free. They had a huge impact in terms of our economy, a huge impact on our debt, and actually we needed to make sure that New Zealanders were getting given the right information.
It's challenging because it was hard. It was hard for the whole country. And it's actually really, I find as a politician, it's also quite hard to talk about it now because, did we get everything right during that time? No, I don't think we did get everything right. Were there lessons that we learned from that? Yes, of course. No one had ever done this before. No government had ever encountered what we encountered with COVID. Undoubtedly, there are things that if we could go back and do them differently, we would do some things differently. I can say that and then someone will ask me a specific question that'll be like, well, what about decision X? And so you explain the reasoning behind that decision, and then they say, oh, so you don't think you made any mistakes? I say, no, I'm not. I'm just explaining why we made the decision we made at that time.
And I don't think anybody said that we did it perfectly the first time, right? I mean, even Chris Hipkins has come onto this show before and said that they recognise that there are a lot of things that they could have done better in hindsight, and a lot of things that can be changed moving forward. Do you accept the fact that at the time and in that pressure cooker situation, a lot of information was being thrown and a lot of information was changing day to day, sometimes even hour by hour, and everything is kind of, rosy in hindsight?
The facts are what is in the Royal Commission, and that he was provided advice that he could lift those restrictions sooner. And instead of taking that to Cabinet, he took a different option to Cabinet to extend it. Not an option put forward by officials, an option he put forward by himself. And Cabinet agreed with a further option to provide further restrictions on Auckland. So it's up to him to explain why he made those decisions. What the report highlights is that those decisions didn't come for free. They came at a cost to New Zealanders who couldn't see their families and their loved ones, a cost to our economy, and a cost to our national debt. And we're still facing those consequences today. And ultimately, we as a government now are faced with the unenviable task of making sure that we put New Zealand back into a fiscally prudent position. And that is exactly what we are doing, because as a country, we are prone to shocks, whether it's economic, whether those are natural disasters, whether it's the future pandemic, and we need to make sure that we as a country are prepared. And the best thing we can do is to make sure that we have fiscal prudent policy in place. And all of those decisions that he made, particularly those ones towards the end of the pandemic and the end of the lockdowns, had an enormous fiscal cost, and we're paying for that still today.
I think another major interesting thing about this Phase 2 report is the discussion around social cohesion, and whether enough weight and had been put on the effects on social cohesion when making some of these decisions. Do you think enough weight had been put on them, for starters?
Well, look, I think at the start of the pandemic, most New Zealanders fully supported the approach the government was taking, and that saved lives, saved livelihoods. as the pandemic continued, decisions were being made in Wellington while Auckland was being locked down. And the report highlights the fact that decision makers were not getting enough information about the actual impacts on the ground and what it actually meant for people who were facing the consequences of the lockdowns. And those social consequences do continue and are still being felt. And so ultimately the report highlights the need to make sure that decision makers are far more connected with actually what is happening on the ground and the real impact of those decisions and what they're having from an economic impact, from a social impact, and the consequences of those are real.
How would you have dealt with the thousands of people rocking up to occupy Parliament grounds? I only ask this because when we talk about social cohesion, that lot is the first people that come to mind that obviously had enough of mandates and restrictions and vaccinations, etc. By that time. Do you think that was handled well?
Well, the previous government promised openness and transparency. That's what they said they were doing. That's what when Chris Hipkins stood up and made his decisions, he said he was following the health advice. The best thing that can be done to improve social cohesion is to ensure that information is being shared publicly, openly, and transparently when it comes to major decisions which impact people's lives, their livelihoods, and balances their rights and their interests with obviously the critically important health needs of the time. And so when it comes to those issues, and there's many New Zealanders who will feel different feelings based on what happened to them, the key thing I think is that a need for openness and transparency, and the key question that Chris Hipkins needs to answer based on the findings of this report is why was some of those decisions he made? Why was the lack of transparency there is something he needs to answer to.
How do you think you would have dealt with those protesters, though?
Well, I think the reality is by ensuring that there was openness and transparency around the key decisions that were being made, I think that would have supported far greater social cohesion then, but also now in terms of those major decisions. These were decisions which had a huge impact on people's lives. And I think that's what people wanted to see
no one's
decision
discounting
makers.
that, obviously. But you can imagine that given what had happened, and then today, if a pandemic were to roll around the corner and arrive at our shores tomorrow, there wouldn't be a lockdown, presumably, right? Because you'd have such a hard time convincing so many people that a lockdown and mandates are okay. How would you deal with that?
Well, ultimately, as a government, you're elected to take into account the advice that you receive from officials. You have to question it, you have to consider it, and then make decisions in the best interests of New Zealand, and you have to justify those decisions as to what those decisions are that you make. The best thing we can do is focus on making sure that we have transparency and openness. One of the recommendations the report says is that we actually need to spend time thinking about what would be the policy approach that would be taken in a future pandemic, which balances people's rights with the need to ensure the health and safety of the public at large and the protection of our health system, and that should be done in a way that is considered carefully and allows for the full public consultation that should be done. So there are a number of recommendations that this report highlights that we will be considering over the coming months in terms of how we respond to this. Because we need to make sure that we do this in a way that New Zealanders feel confident in how these decisions would be made.
The kids not at school. The behaviour of so many that's been out of control, if not outrageous. The moral fatigue, the social decline, the malaise, that is not measured in total stats. But the overarching feeling this country is a shadow of what it once was. That's the real story of COVID. But I still maintain, write all the reports you want, inquire until you're blue in the face. A pandemic is luck. If the government that's in on the day the pandemic arrives is good, you'll be okay. If it's Labor 2017 through 2023, well, you don't need a report. Just look at us.
And just finally, Minister, New Zealand is currently experiencing a 9th COVID wave. The latest Health New Zealand figures show 50 hospitalisations at the time of recording, 19 deaths with the virus in the past week. Should we be concerned? What information are you getting about this?
Yeah, so ultimately, COVID is now part of what goes round in terms of the flus and COVID and other respiratory illnesses that are in our in New Zealand, but also globally. The government spends a significant amount of money responding to that. We have the COVID vaccination available for New Zealanders to use. We do a lot of testing in our hospitals. We have treatments available to treat people who have COVID. We of course have the wastewater testing as well, so we can measure the amount that is going through around New Zealand as well. So ultimately, it's important that New Zealanders continue to be mindful. And those treatments and those vaccinations are available, and people should talk to their GP or their health professional in relation to those. And so we continue to provide the tools. Those tools are available to our health system in order to support it to respond to COVID, just as we do with the flu and with other illnesses which go around in our community.
So we shouldn't be worried.
Well, I mean, it is obviously a serious issue in terms of it's still a large amount of cases, but we are providing the tools that our health system needs in order to be able to respond to what we are seeing.
And by the way, do we know how much this entire process of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 Royal Commission of Inquiries has cost?
It's approximately $30 million. Slightly more was spent on Phase 1 than on Phase 2. It's come in within the budget that was set at the time. And as with every Royal Commission, now it's up to the government to consider the recommendations. We'll be reporting back in July, taking into account the recommendations from Phase 1 and from Phase 2 with a full response to this inquiry.
I like how you had to dig in and say that actually Phase 1 cost a little bit more than Phase 2. How much did each phase cost?
I think it was around 17 million for Phase 1 and around 14 million for Phase 2, but I can come back with the exact amount. I think in total it was around $30 million.
Thanks for joining us, Minister.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is hosted and produced by me, Chelsea Daniels. Kane Dickey is our studio operator, Richard Martin, our producer and editor, and our executive producer is Jane Yee. Follow The Front Page on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for another look beyond the headlines.